Professor Akbarzadeh, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to start right away with the first question.
Yes.
Islamist populism has been a significant force in various political movements worldwide. In the context of theocratic Iran, how does sectarian Islamist populism manifest, and to what extent does it influence public discourse and policymaking?
Okay. So I think if you want to look at populism, populism in Iran refers to the Ummah. So the Iranian regime has come to office, have come to power with the concept of promoting the interests of the Ummah. And Ummah is a global concept. Although it is applied in the context of Iran, and for all intents and purposes, it refers to the Iranian nation. There is always a sense that Iranian nation, the Iranian Ummah, will provide a role model for the global Ummah to follow. So if you look at the language and the signals that the leadership sends, the idea is that the Iranian revolution has opened the way to show the global Ummah how to, what the steps they need to take to bring Islamic model of government and Islamic justice into existence. So that is very much consistent. It's been from the beginning of the revolution, 1949. That idea of Iran leading the way was put in the constitution, enshrined in the constitution. It very much informs Iranian foreign policy making, and it has continued on. And so even now, so as an example, when the Arab Spring happened 10 years ago now, the Arab Spring happened, and we know that the popular movement in many Arab countries wasn't about Islam. It wasn't about Islamic state, creating Islamic model of government. In fact, we know that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is probably the most renowned actor in that space, was taken on, it was on a back foot. It didn't know how to respond to the Arab Spring. It had to play catch-up game. But the Iranians held events, held conferences, and presented the Arab Spring as an Islamic awakening. And they said in their narrative, the Arab population was finally waking up to the reality that Iran was providing the model. Iran was a trailblazer, and they could follow the Iranian model. So that's the narrative that is often used. The Ummah and the Islamic regime is the, leading the Ummah, representing the Ummah, standing up for the Ummah globally. And everything that follows through in terms of relations with the United States, in relation to Israel, what's happening in Palestine, and all of that is presented from that point of view.
All right. In the Iranian historical and political context, do differences in populism exist among various actors, such as former and current presidents, Ayatollah Khamenei, and Ayatollah Khomeini, judicial and military figures?
There isn't much difference between different actors in the Iranian elite. Probably the most significant difference in the way that leaders have referred to, you use the term populism, and I think we have to be clear that we are referring to the concept of Ummah here. It's a very religious approach to populism. Probably the most significant differences between the reformists and the more conservative camp. So in that sense, only President Khatami was trying to, in a way, distinguish himself and break away from the dominant narrative of the Ummah, and started talking about dialogue of civilization. So talking about how people can learn from each other. So again, it's civilizational. It's not a complete break from the Ummah, as you might imagine, because he was saying Islamic civilization. It's not a complete break from that, from the dominant perspective, but it is introducing a degree of fine-tuning and differentiation between different people, different cultures. So yeah, I mean, but we have gone back with the arrival of President Raisi in office and the consolidation of power in the hands of the conservatives in Iran. We have gone back to the very original 40-year-old perspective on the Islamic Ummah, Iran at the helm of the global Islamic Ummah, representing the Muslim nation against the United States, against Israel, and so on and so forth.
Iran is frequently depicted as a theocratic authoritarian state, where the amalgamation of theocratic principles with sui generis authoritarian governance profoundly shapes both domestic policies and interactions with the international community. Within this framework, the notion of theocratic populism arises as a pivotal aspect of Iran's political terrain. How does the Iranian government strategically utilize the principles of theocracy in a populist manner to garner popular support domestically and internationally?
Yeah, I think this builds on the previous conversation, the previous points we were making, and that is Iran is represented, the Islamic Republic represents itself as the champion of the Muslim Ummah. That means that they represent everyone else as betraying the Muslim Ummah. That means discrediting neighboring states for their failure, supposed failure, to stand up for Islam, to failure to stand up for the interest of the Muslims globally. And they point a finger to obviously Saudi Arabia as the arch rival of Iran, for neglecting Palestinians, for neglecting the Israeli behavior, and for even starting to negotiate, starting to entertain the idea of an Abrahamic Accord, of signing a normalization deal with Israel. So that perspective, Iran at the helm of the global Muslim Ummah, really filters through everything else that Iran does in the region and also internationally. Domestically, it allows the leadership to dismiss dissent, dismiss opposing views on governance, dismiss women's interests, for example, women's rights, as something that is borrowed from the West, something that's not indigenous, that doesn't originate from the traditions of the country, and uses that to justify why hijab is compulsory, why political opposition is not allowed, banned, and why people need to be respectful and follow the Islamic leaders, the theocratic leaders. So dismissing alien views, alien practices, women's rights, individual rights, liberties, all of these are central and integral to the way that the regime justifies itself.
Considering the complex interplay between Islamism, Islamist populism, theocratic and theocratic authoritarianism, what are the main challenges and opportunities for political reform and evolution within Iran, particularly in light of the country's unique blend of theocratic governance and sui generis electoral politics?
Yeah, it's funny that Iran holds elections and uses that to make a claim that the regime is popular because it is based on the participation of people going to the ballot box and voting. So there's presidential election, parliamentary election, municipal elections, but they often jump over the fact and forget the fact, deliberately forgetting the fact that all these elections are closely orchestrated, carefully orchestrated, and closely watched. That all these elections are really a show to some degree. And that degree is you have a council, in the Guardian Council, that has the authority to vet candidates, has the authority to say yes or no to candidates standing for election based on their level of loyalty to the Supreme Leader. So we've had really weird cases of sitting parliamentarians who have, who have been critical of the behavior of the conservatives, who have, who are probably in the reformist camp, Khatami's camp, sitting parliamentarians who have been vetoed, who've been vetted out of standing for election for the subsequent parliament because of their loyalty, questionable loyalty, to the Supreme Leader. So I think elections play an important role in how Iranian leadership, the religious leadership justifies itself. It doesn't want to give up on elections. The Supreme Leader has been very clear about this, very vocal about this, and at the last election, I'm sure we're going to come to it later, but in the last parliamentary election, the Supreme Leader said, even if you don't agree with me, still come and vote, because they see participation in elections as a key indicator of political legitimacy. So they need to keep the elections, but controlled, because elections serve a purpose for legitimacy of the regime. But the regime has a Supreme Leader at the helm, and the Supreme Leader is not elected. And the Supreme Leader has all these levers of control, controlling the armed forces, controlling the judiciary, controlling who sits basically on the Guardian Council, and the Guardian Council decides who is elected to the parliament. So the Supreme Leader has ultimate control. This is how the authoritarian system works. Give an impression of choice, but maintain actual control. I'm not sure if I answered the question. I have to think about what. Did I answer the question?
Yes, I think so.
I got a bit sidetracked with my response.
How does the Iranian regime utilize advanced IT and digital technologies to extend the reach of its repression and authoritarian digital information strategies, both domestically and internationally?
That's a new area for the Islamic Republic of Iran. But it's a new area that they have thrown themselves into when during the Green Movement, 2009, Yeah, 2009, the Green Movement. A lot of people were using Facebook, not so much Twitter, but mostly Facebook, to organize events, to organize protest movements, protest activities, protest rallies. And it became very clear to the regime that social media and internet could really serve as a vehicle for dissent, as a vehicle for opposition. And they watched what's going on elsewhere in the region. The Arab Spring followed quickly after, and elsewhere. So they realized, hang on a minute, people are going using these social media tools to mobilize against the regime. So this online activity is transferring and leading into physical activity in the streets that is threatening the survival of the regime. So they started looking around. What can we do about this? And they look at China and look at other places. They realize you need to come to grips and get control over the internet, get control over what social media is doing. So they have invested significantly in developing mechanism and structures to control the internet. They've taken a leaf out of Chinese book on building a firewall around the country. So there's going to be a national intranet, so to speak. So it's controlled within the country. And basically disconnecting Iranian internet users in the country from the outside world. So that's a very real threat to freedom of expression and access to information by the population in Iran, because once that wall is up, then it's very difficult to bypass it. The population, Iranian internet users are quite resourceful. They are using various VPNs to access the internet, and they are finding ways, satellites and so on. But it is a real threat to access to information for the citizens in Iran. The regime has also developed really high-tech surveillance technologies, facial recognition, so just watching people and putting various cameras up in public places so that the regime can surveil the population, see what's going on, and quickly act on it. In case there is protest brewing, send security forces. If they're looking for someone, apply facial recognition software and identify the person if they step out in any of the public places. So IT, internet has become the next frontier for the regime to get control of and suppress dissent. It's an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing challenge. I can't say that the regime has won in securing control and manipulating the internet, but there are serious risks here.
It is widely acknowledged that authoritarian regimes engage in extensive and intensive collaboration among themselves. In this context, how does the Iranian regime collaborate with countries such as China and Russia to expand its capacity to enforce its theocratic authoritarianism?
Yes, well, that's a very big question. Iran has looked at China, as I mentioned earlier, for technology. So borrowing technology from China in terms of internet control, surveillance, but also in terms of gaining Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative that China is promoting. Because Iran has been under sanctions for 40 odd years, and Iranian economy has been in free fall. So Iran needs external investment in Chinese technology to really help alleviate the damage that sanctions has done to the Iranian economy and the Iranian armed forces. So China plays a big role for Iran. Same token, Russia plays a very important role for Iran. The role that Russia plays is probably less in terms of technological transfer, but in terms of diplomatic protection, political protection that Russia can provide Iran. So given the tension between Russia and the United States, there has been even more of a congruence of interest between the two countries. And Iran has been very keen to demonstrate its commitment to Russia, its value to Russia in responding and challenging Western control and Western hegemony. And it all came out during a war in Ukraine. Iran has developed its own homegrown drone technology, borrowed from various sources, but largely homegrown, which has proven very effective because you have low-flying drones that evade radar detection. And once you send out a lot of them, a lot of these low-flying drones that are cheaper to produce than some of the sophisticated drones that the US produces, they can really overwhelm defense. And Russia has used them to target Ukraine, hit Ukraine, and has been very happy with the performance of these drones to an extent that Russia has invited Iran to build a drone manufacturing base in Russia. So now we have a transfer of low technology, low tech from Iran to Russia. So because Iran values having Russia as its backer on the international stage. So when there are discussions on Iran, resolutions on Iran at the United Nations Security Council, Iran then expects Russia and China to be vetoing those kind of resolutions and protecting Iran against further sanctions. This is a bit ambitious from the Iranian point of view because historically both Russia and China have shied away from blocking such sanctions, such resolutions. Because Russia and China both have their own interests. They have their own agenda. And they calculate risks to their own economy, to their own interests, before standing up and sticking their neck out for Iran. But from the Iranian point of view, this is a wise move, and it's in Iran's interest to stick with Russia and China internationally.
Right. The latest Iranian presidential election and recent parliamentary elections saw a historically low turnout, signaling widespread disillusionment with the Mullah regime among the electorate. To what extent do you perceive the record low turnout of 41% in the recent elections, which was the first in the aftermath of the killing of Masha Amini, as indicative of deeper societal shifts and potential challenges to the legitimacy and future of the current regime in Iran?
But this was a major wake-up call for the authorities, because as I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been very vocal about the significance of participation in election. He's been saying it repeatedly, even if you don't agree with me, come and vote. Because voting, even if you disagree with me, voting is an indication of the regime's legitimacy as a whole. So the low turnout was a concern, major concern, and the figure that you're citing, 41%, is a national figure. That figure is even more worrying if you look at participation rate in urban centers. So Tehran, for example, had a turnout percentage of something like 25%, even lower than the national 41%. So 25% of population in Tehran, only 25% of eligible voters went to the ballot boxes. This is a shock. It's a shock. But it's not a surprise, because if you listen to what was being said, the slogans of the protesters during Mahsa Amini, when she died in custody for supposedly bad hijab, the women in the streets were shouting against the supreme leader. They're saying, let's end the dictatorship. They're saying, down with the dictator, down with the supreme leader. They weren't just calling for choice. Of course, choice was a demand. Choice to wear hijab or not wear hijab. Of course, that was a demand. But it went much, much further than that. It rejected the legitimacy of the supreme leader and the Islamic regime as representing the nation. So that protest was put down by brute force. Brute force is what the authoritarian regimes do. They use brute force. They bring soldiers in the streets, security forces in the streets, and shoot people down and torture them and imprison them. So brute force worked, but I think the regime has realized that its legitimacy is very much at stake, challenged, some might say non-existent. And the turnout at the election, 41% nationwide, 25% in Tehran, is another reminder and indicator that the regime is in trouble.
In light of the recent legislative elections held on March the 1st, could you provide an analysis of the historical significance of these elections within the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran's political evolution and the broader trajectory of its governance structures?
I think we have already covered legitimacy, which is a big factor. Lack of. Also, what this election demonstrated was that the hardliners have managed to basically gain complete control of all organs of power in Iran. You have the judiciary, the presidency, the parliament, all of them very much in the firm control of the hardliners. In the past, there has been some level of diversity, some level of differentiation. The parliament, even if the most hardline, the most conservative form of parliament we've had, still contained a number of reformists and reformist faction who could challenge and air some level of dissent and opposition. With the current parliament, the elected parliament, we don't have that. It's a very conservative body. So we see a homogenization of power, homogenization of people in power. Now, having said that, we are also seeing some level of differentiation. So the conservatives, you can even group them into pragmatists and hardliners. So we have Bagher Ghalibaf, who was in the previous parliament. He's a conservative. He's not a reformist, but he's not gaining gaining a popular vote. Even he is being sidelined. So we see the power shifting even within the conservative camp more towards the hardliner camp. So What does that tell us? It tells us that the regime is becoming even more removed from the population, more removed from the electorate. So that distinction between the regime and the people, if we had that 10 years ago, it's even greater. That distinction, that gap has become even greater. The leadership is even more divorced from the electorate. What will they do? What kind of what a policy implication that has? I think quite dire political implications, because they are so removed. They don't even feel compelled to respond to popular demands. They don't even feel that they need to respond to popular demands, because they are so removed from the people. And the parliament has become even more of a echo chamber. And no one to challenge it. The president, parliament, the judiciary, all in the conservative hardline camp. It becomes an echo chamber to reinforce their ideological beliefs about where Iran should go and what policies Iran should follow, internationally and domestically.
Right. In the wake of tragic killing of Mahsa Amini in September 2022, how would you characterize the regime's response to the perceived erosion of its authority, particularly in relation to its handling of societal discontent? And what insights can we glean from the evolution of women's movement regarding the advancements in women's empowerment within Iran?
I think what happened in the wake of Mahsa Amini's killing and during the women life freedom movement, what we witnessed was that fear factor was being blunted. That fear factor wasn't going to send the people back home from the streets. Public rallies couldn't be suppressed by suppression alone. I say that with a degree of hesitation, because it took the authorities about a year or so to suppress the popular movement. But they did suppress the movement. So we don't have public rallies anymore. But I think the suppression succeeded not just by brute force, but by due to the fact that there was no organized leadership in opposition. There was no clear alternative to the Islamic Republic. That the opposition was divided into many different groupings: leftists, loyalists, liberals, a whole bunch of them. And that meant there was no single voice. Even though everyone was united against the regime, there was no unity for an alternative. And that really undermined the opposition movement, the women's movement, and that allowed suppression to succeed in removing the movement. But also, I want to pay homage to the women of Iran for standing up for themselves for so long. Even now, on social media, you can see Iranian women walking in the streets, going shopping without their headscarf on, without wearing the hijab. They are fearless. They are fearless. So I think that's important to acknowledge.
Right. And lastly, Professor Akbarzadeh, the Iranian leadership appears confident in prevailing center heads in Washington, leading them to continue grandstanding and goading the United States in the absence of a nuclear deal. With the upcoming elections and possible return of Donald Trump to the power in the US, how do you anticipate the shifting political landscape might affect Iran's strategy and its relationship with the West?
Iran has made a mastery of brinksmanship. Iran has been, in all the negotiations, nuclear talks, has always pushed to the very edge and tried to extract as much as possible in negotiations with, with partners, United States and Europe. And that has worked from that because the interlocutors have been rational actors. So Iran has dealt with the various administrations because the US administration has been rational in its response. Europeans have been rational in their response to Iran. With prospects of Trump coming to office, we can't expect that the administration in Washington will act rationally. It's quite possible that they would act irrationally. In fact, the reality that Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear agreement after years of negotiation, and it was working for two and a half years or so, it was working. But the Trump administration said, nah, we're going to pull out, we'll get a better deal. That never happened. They destroyed the nuclear deal and sent us on this path of heightened tension and uncertainty. So with prospects of Trump coming to office, I think we are in for a very uncertain future. Conservative hardliners in office in Iran, a very unpredictable US administration. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It's very difficult to predict what will happen.
All right, Professor Akbarzadeh, thank you so very much. We appreciate.
Thanks for having me. Lovely to talk to you.
All the best.
Okay, thank you.